Those people below ground who have been emerging, telling desperate stories of trying to get up to safety. Reports of disaster began around 8:45 this morning. A power surge on the subway, trains colliding, passengers trapped in darkness, gasping for air, breaking windows to escape, and perhaps most worrisome, then reports of explosions.
There was an explosion, a flash of light, everything went dark, train ground to a halt.
There was an emergency to you on the terrible events that have happened in London earlier today. And I hope you understand that at the present time we're still trying to establish exactly what has happened. And there's a limit to what information I can give you, and I'll simply try and tell you the information as best I can at the moment. It's reasonably clear that there have been a series of terrorist attacks in London. There are obviously casualties, both people that have died and people seriously injured. And our thoughts and prayers, of course, are with the victims and their families. It's my intention to leave the G8 within the next couple of hours and go down to London and get a report face-to-face with the police and the emergency services and the ministers that have been dealing with this, and then to return later this evening. It is the will of all the leaders at the G8, however, that the meeting should continue in my absence, that we should continue to discuss the issues that we were going to discuss and reach the conclusions which we were going to reach. Each of the countries around that table has some experience of the effects of terrorism, and all the leaders, as they will indicate a little bit later, share our complete resolution to defeat this terrorism. It's particularly barbaric that this has happened on a day when people are meeting to try to help the problems of poverty in Africa and the long-term problems of climate change and the environment. Just as it is reasonably clear that this is a terrorist attack or a series of terrorist attacks, it's also reasonably clear that it is designed and aimed to coincide with the opening of the G8. There will be time to talk later about this. It's important, however, that those engaged in terrorism realize that our determination to defend our values and our way of life.
That, of course, was British Prime Minister Tony Blair speaking, obviously understandably rattled and quite emotional. He said that he will be returning to London within the next few hours, will meet with police and then return to the G8 summit, of course, which is officially underway today with leaders of all the industrialized nations meeting in Scotland. And of course,
he verbalized what we were all thinking, that it's reasonably clear these, in fact, were terrorist attacks.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go to Ron Allen, who we interrupted in London for Prime Minister Blair's remarks, to give us the very latest on what's going on there. Ron?
Well, Katie, it is still a disaster that is still unfolding. We're hearing reports of convoys of buses taking injured that has been planted somewhere, and police have now essentially confirmed that they have found evidence of explosives at least one blast site, and we're hearing that there may have been as many as 7 separate blasts and perhaps 3 buses.
And in fact, Ron, the numbers have varied. We've heard at least 90 casualties at one subway station or in one section of the subway. And so far, only 2 fatalities, but those numbers are very, very preliminary at this point, aren't they?
Very preliminary, Katie, yes. And 90 casualties in this country can mean people who are injured or people who are dead. That's the way they use this word. Another important thing is that the stations that were targeted were very critical to London, the city. One was in the heart of the financial district. Another was in a heavily traveled tourist area. Another, King's Cross, was one of the busiest travel stations anywhere in the city, right in the middle of London. So again, this appears not to have been a random act. You've heard Prime Minister Blair say it appears that it's terrorism. It's every indication of that, coordinated and apparently very, very deadly. Katie?
All right, Ron, as we heard from Ron Allen just moments ago, it's been pure pandemonium in London as police try to figure out what happened and as some of the victims try to get out of this terrible, terrible situation. Let's listen to one witness who recounts what was seen.
He's meeting at the G8 have had experience with terrorism. Let's find out the official reaction from Washington. Let's go to NBC's Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, has the U.S. changed its terror alert posture as a result of this?
No, Homeland Security officials tell us that they have not changed their terror alert posture. In fact, the immediate response, the only immediate response here in Washington, was not by Homeland Security officials, but by local metropolitan transit authorities who did increase the police and dog sniffing presence in the subways here in Washington. Intelligence officials say they had no indication of early warnings. Now, there was one report on the Associated Press that Israeli officials were saying that they had been warned by London that there was some prior indication. This, of course, after the attack. But according to U.S. intelligence officials, there was no increased chatter, no indication. It does mark one hallmark of al-Qaeda, which is multiple explosions or al-Qaeda imitators, as the Madrid experience was, because the Madrid bombing was by terror groups associated with al-Qaeda, but not al-Qaeda Central. This does also mark, by the way, the 8th time that there has been a terror incident within weeks of a warning, a taped warning, by the number 2 al-Qaeda operative, Ayman al-Zawahiri.
NBC's Andrea
Lester.
Mitchell in Washington. Andrea, thanks very much. Now, 10 minutes after the hour, let's turn back to Katie.
All right, Lester, now we'll turn to Kelly O'Donnell, who has been traveling with the president to Scotland for the G8 summit. She joins us, we believe, on the phone. Kelly, are you there?
Katie, I can hear you. I am in Glen Eagles, where President Bush was with Prime Minister Blair in a working breakfast this morning at the time when these attacks occurred. Senior White House officials tell us the president was briefed and has continued to receive updates. We now know from hearing Tony Blair that the president must be among those leaders who will not be returning to his home country of Washington. This meeting intended to go forward. The president has been out of public view for some time now. He was in the company of the prime minister, presumably able to receive updates directly from him and with him, and senior officials tell us that they are in touch, giving the president updates as we go forward. And, of course, the whole schedule here at the G8 remains in question, but the president has been closely following these developments. Katie?
Kelly, is there some thinking that this was coordinated to basically occur simultaneously with the official opening of
Was of great concern and obvious because the morning breakfast sessions were going on, what they call a bilateral session with just the U.S. and Great Britain meeting together. That timing, of course, critical. These two leaders who have both been very strong advocates in the war on terror were together at the time these blasts occurred. That timing certainly noted by Prime Minister Tony Blair. Unclear yet whether Mr. Bush will make a public statement, but protocol would have that Tony Blair would go first, as he has done so, and we are anticipating to hear from White House officials any public statements or public movements of the president. We do expect him to return to the sessions, but again, closely following developments in London. Katie?
But again, Kelly, no information as to whether the president will be returning to the United States today or tomorrow. What is his schedule? What is his planned schedule at this point?
Well, there were sessions in which they called them working sessions, meeting with the members of the other G8 leaders. At this time, the president had some scheduled downtime where he would be in his suite. He remains out of public view. He was scheduled to return to the United States on Friday evening, arriving back in Washington around 6:30 Washington time. Mrs. Bush on a scheduled trip to leave the G8 and head to Africa, Africa being a central theme of the G8 summit, trying to provide more aid to that country for its severely impoverished and also to address issues of health. Those public schedules remain intact as far as we know. We have put forth many questions to senior White House officials who are both traveling with the president and those at the White House. Tony Blair's comments suggest that he received some sort of agreement from the other leaders to keep this session going forward.
Former White House counterterrorism expert and it currently is an NBC News analyst. Roger, good morning.
Good morning, Katie.
Well,
That tape, there was not a specific mention of the United Kingdom. It talked in very general terms about Western governments and their oppression of the Islamic world. But we've seen, of course, as a pattern in the past with Zawahiri, and now we're seeing it play out again. Whenever there is a tape, either an audio message or a video message, and an attack like this follows, then it gives something for the intelligence community and all governments to work on to try and see other attacks come and hopefully stop those.
No city in the world, I understand, has many surveillance cameras as London, so much of this might be caught. I guess the actual explosions on videotape, do you think that will be helpful in aiding police and determining who's responsible for this?
Absolutely. London has something called the Ring of Steel, a closed-circuit TV network where really there's no part of downtown London that does not have a camera on it. So what British authorities will do is review that tape, see that can they identify specific individuals, are there packages, things like that.
What about transportation systems in other parts of the world? It's very, very difficult to protect these systems from terrorist attacks.
David, has an official statement been released from the White House?
Nothing yet. The president's at the G8 conference, of course, in Glen Eagles. We heard from Kelly O'Donnell. From my vantage point, I know it was just after 6 a.m. when the president's top counterterrorism officials were mobilized, brought in here to the Situation Room, the team led by Fran Townsend, his counterterror top advisor, others from the National Security Council, and other senior White House officials, all gathering in the Situation Room to gather the kind of information that Roger Cressy was talking about. Their initial concern would be about any potential for follow-on attacks, whether there's any Homeland Security concern for the United States about potential attacks, gleaning as much information as they can from the outside. Obviously, authorities in London are working on providing information to U.S. authorities and, of course, just coordinating their own information there. So now it's the job of those in the Situation Room here at the White House to coordinate with other governments to find out what warnings may have been in place, with U.S. intelligence officials, of course, about what may have been known prior to the attack. And all of that is happening now.
NBC's David Gregory at the White House. David, thanks very much. 18 after the hour. Here's Katie.
Lester, thank you so much. Alex Thompson from ITN is joining us now from London with the latest on these explosions that occurred just about, I guess, an hour and a half ago in London. Alex, what can you tell us? What's the latest?
Well, the latest is that it is confirmed as a terrorist incident. Tony Blair is going to leave the G8 summit meeting in Glen Eagles, come down to London, take a briefing on the situation, then return back to Scotland for that international grouping. We know there are fatalities. It's clear there are at least 4 or 5 explosions across London. Most of those have been on the underground, the subway system, as you'd say. And again, at peak time, at rush hour, there was at least, though, one device which appears to have been placed on a London bus. It blew the roof off the bus. It's believed there are some fatalities. 2 fatalities at least in the underground station just behind me, Aldgate Station, close to Liverpool Street, one of the main commuter routes into the city. It was, of course, rush hour. They're reporting at this incident alone at least 100 people injured, 2 dead, and at least 10 listed on the as critical. So clearly a very major casualty list there. That is just one, as I say, of at least 4 or 5 incidents across London, all of them clearly timed, A, for rush hour, and B, of course, to coincide with the G8 meeting.
All right, Alex Thompson in London. Alex, thank you so much for that update. Again, the incident took place around 4 a.m. Eastern Time, shortly before 4 a.m. Shortly, the check of the morning's other stories from Natalie Morales. Natalie, good morning.
And good morning to you, Katie. Good morning, everyone. In other news now, the first Atlantic hurricane of the season is heading directly toward Jamaica this morning and could impact the U.S. within days. Hurricane Dennis, now a Category 1 storm, but it is expected to strengthen before hitting Jamaica. Floodwaters have already cut off some rural residents on the
weather from Weekend Today's Janice Huff, who's in for Al this morning. Janice, good morning.
Good morning. We talked about Dennis a few moments ago, but we're now focused on the remnants of Tropical Depression Cindy. That continues to move through parts of the southeast, producing flooding rains in Georgia and South Carolina this morning. As it moves towards the northeast, it could produce locally 6.
Janice, thanks so much. Still to come this morning on Today, we'll have much more from London, where there have been multiple explosions this morning in the city's transit system. It's apparently a terrorist attack. We'll have more on that, but first, this is Today on NBC.
Tonight. It'll calm down. Yes.
Would you have sold this morning anyway, given that we hit new all-time highs last night, based on the path of Dennis, perhaps? I mean, there was some thought of that here before the attack. Would you have sold today anyway?
Well, I think that every futures trade that anyone makes, regardless
there, and starting to gather information to get some indication of how the day is going to go. I noticed that the Dow futures have also rallied off their lows. They were down 200, now they're down 150. Bob?
Yeah, Mark, I've just spoken with some spokespeople at the New York Stock Exchange. They have told me that they will be having a statement on these attacks in London a little bit later in the morning. CEO John Thain, the CEO of the New York Stock Exchange, is not available for interviews right now. We're seeing if we might be able to get him on the phone. As far as the way the building looks, there are no traders here right now. They start trickling in the next half hour or so. Some of them are upstairs already having breakfast, but the security around this building is little changed, but that's not saying too much. This is one of the most heavily guarded buildings on the planet, and down here we have long been used to streets that have been closed off, barricades that come up out of the ground, heavily guarded buildings, police dogs, and submachine guns. That's just the way business is done down here these days. The futures, as you mentioned, Mark, and we tend to look at the S&P futures down here, down about 18 points right now, but that is well off of the lows that they saw earlier today. We were down, I guess as much as 25, 26 points in the S&P futures. So we have come off the lows there. I see Germany and France down about 3% here right now. And the interesting thing, of course, is that we've been seeing 4-year highs in the European markets recently. Both France and England and even Germany were sitting at 4-year highs just recently. So as soon as I get some more information from the New York Stock Exchange, Mark, I'll get back to you.
All right, thank you very much, Bob Pisani. At the New York Stock Exchange. You just saw a note there that France has gone to an elevated terror alert situation. There has been nothing out of Washington so far to indicate that the U.S. will change its terror alert. Most people would consider tourist London, the Houses of Parliament and things of that nature. Russell Square, about a mile north of that area of London where many tourists which many tourists are familiar with. Joining us now by phone with his insights, Ian Bremmer, president of the Eurasia Group. Ian, good morning. Thanks for being with us. Ian, New York Times, and he linked this attack to the opening of the G8. He said this was...
We're back at 7:30 on this Wednesday morning. It is the 7th day of July. The year is 2005. We are following a breaking story out of London. Inside Studio 1, I'm Katie Couric with Lester Holt, who's in for Matt. As I mentioned, it appears to be a terrorist attack during the morning rush hour in London. First reports coming in about 8:50 that there had been some kind of electrical...
I thought it was power surges going on.
Some kind of power surge, exactly. But there have been near simultaneous explosions. It's unclear exactly how many, but perhaps 6, maybe 7 throughout the tube, which is London's subway system.
Then we saw that video there just a moment ago of a double-decker bus. The top was ripped off by an explosion. Apparently it was placed in the back of the bus, is what we're hearing.
That's right. Let's listen to one eyewitness account.
The windows came in.
Morning. For more on the story, let's go to the news desk and Natalie Morales. Natalie?
Good morning once again, Katie, and more now on the latest terror attacks in London. As we've mentioned, a number of people were killed and wounded in the multiple explosions today. City buses and subways were hit by the blasts. The explosions have prompted a greater police presence on subways in Washington, D.C., but right now Homeland Security officials say they have no plans to raise the terror threat level. But let's go right now to NBC's Ron Allen, who joins us from London. Bring us up to date, Ron.
Good morning, Natalie. It's a very, very serious morning here. The subway and bus systems are shut down. There is chaos and havoc on the streets of London, emergency crews everywhere.
And let's go right now to the G8 summit in Gleneagles, Scotland, where we get reaction now from NBC's Kelly O'Donnell, as we just heard from Prime Minister Tony Blair there a short while ago. Good morning to you, Kelly.
Good morning, Natalie. If I can take a moment to sort of walk you through the day's events from the perspective of President Bush. At the time these attacks first occurred, the president was meeting with Prime Minister Tony Blair in what's described in the parlance of the G8 as a working breakfast, there to talk about issues like aid to Africa, climate change. The president and Prime Minister even had a news availability where they addressed reporters and answered a few questions. At that time, the tone of their meeting was one focused on the substantive substantive issues of this G8, and the president even speaking in a very lighthearted way about the bicycle accident he had last evening in which he incurred some cuts and scrapes. At that particular time, it was just the first alert of some problems in London, not yet identified as a terrorist attack. Since that time, senior White House officials who are traveling with the president say he was briefed on the situation and has received updates on an ongoing basis. For at least some of that time, the president and prime minister were together, and one could assume that they were receiving those briefings simultaneously and the two nations working together to try to assess the scope and the nature of these attacks. The president has not yet made a public statement. It was expected that the prime minister would do so first, and we hear at least some of the G8 leaders, if not all of those heads of state who are here, may be making a joint comment at some point. Tony Blair did say in his public remarks that all of the leaders agreed to continue this G8 summit, to work on the issues that brought them together. So from that, we expect that the president will not leave early to return to Washington. Natalie?
Kelly O'Donnell in Glen Eagle, Scotland. Thank you, Kelly. And now it is now 7:35. Let's go over to Janice for Check of Your Weather.
Today's weather is brought to you by LendingTree.com.
All right, thank you, Janice. We're still trying to get a grip on the scope of this disaster, the attacks in London. Let's go to NBC's James Hattori. He joins me now on the telephone from the streets of central London. James, what are you seeing and what are you hearing?
Well, I must tell you, Lester, from our vantage point, as serious as some of the incidents appear to be, a large part of London is still functioning, and I don't want to, case of some sort of explosive device, and that is big.
James, we're losing your phone signal, but I think we have the gist of it, that many parts of London continue to function, but certainly they're still trying to get a grip on how many attacks. Believe there were 6, and still trying to come up with a toll of the number of casualties. We'll check back on the streets of London as events warrant. But right now, let's go to Katie.
All right, Lester. Roger Cressy is a former White House.
Events in London where there have been several apparent terrorist bombings related to public transit, most on the underground, one involving a double-decker bus. Still no firm number of casualties as rescuers continue on the scene. Meanwhile, in Washington, intelligence authorities now are gathering to sift through intelligence as they know it. NBC's David Gregory is at the White House. David, let me first ask you, the president is in Scotland. Do we know where the vice president is right now?
The vice president's actually in Wyoming and at his ranch. There's no plans for him to return immediately. He's got some downtime there. He's no doubt in touch with officials at the Situation Room. Roger Cressy.
The lead agency in the U.S. on this?
Well, certainly the Director of National Intelligence, John.
Ron Allen is covering the story from London. Ron, what's the latest from there?
Well, we're expecting to hear soon from the British Home Secretary about what he knows and what he can tell the public about what has happened. We believe that the rescue operations are still underway at least one of the subway stations. It's unclear how many. We hope to hear more.
I was just going to ask you about the city being sealed off. Are people being prohibited from entering London at this point?
We believe so. There is something called a ring of steel around the city, which again is a cordon that protects the city from terrorist attacks. London has had a lot of experience.
They head to buses and trains for their daily commute. Local authorities in many cases taking their own special security precautions as a result. Let's go to New York's Grand Central Station right now, and NBC's Don Fratangelo standing by. Don?
Good morning, Lester. There has been no official word of heightened security here at Grand Central Station. On any given day, about 500,000 people commute through Grand Central. Inside, though, there is a sense of calm. I talked to a couple of commuters about 15 minutes ago. They had heard about the blasts in London, but it was not affecting their morning commute. It was actually somewhat slow. A lot of people imagine because of the continued 4th of July holiday. Security was increased here at Grand Central, as I said, which about 500,000 people come through here on any given day. It was increased after the bombing in Madrid in 2004. There were more security officers. They were handing out flyers asking commuters to be aware of any suspicious packages, any suspicious people. But right now, the commute here this morning seems to be going very smoothly, very calm. No official word of heightened security here, Lester.
All right, Don Fratangelo, we will check back with you a bit later on. Thanks very much. Let's turn back to Katie now.
Lester, thanks so much. Apparently, James Hattori is on the phone from London. And what happened?
I was trying to get on the tube station in Kilburn Park, and they told me the tube station was closed, so I hopped on a bus, and as I was approaching the Edgware station, I saw people coming out of the train station, and they'd obviously had smoke inhalation. I mean, you could see the burns on their faces, and we began triaging patients. I was helping out the person who was in charge. She did a very good job. She was the doctor in charge there. And we began triaging patients, separating the patients who were badly injured from the ones who were walking wounded. And what we did is we got all their contact information, listed their injuries on a piece of paper, and then transported the people who were in most need of medical attention first, and then in priority after that for people who were less injured.
And real quickly, Sean, the most serious injuries, what did they involve? Check back with you if you could just stand by. We'll be back with much more right after this. Good morning. At least a half a dozen explosions on the London transit system this morning. This comes as world leaders are meeting at this hour at the G8 summit in Glen Eagles, Scotland, including British Prime Minister Tony Blair, who earlier called this a barbaric act by terrorists today, Thursday, July the 7th, 2005.
From NBC News, this is Today with Katie Couric and Matt Lauer, live from Studio 1A in Rockefeller Plaza.
And welcome to this special edition of Today on this Thursday morning. I'm Katie Couric.
And I'm Lester Holt. The London police chief is saying this was, in fact, a coordinated attack. They occurred near simultaneous,
right?
Yeah, mostly on the subways and then one on a bus.
That's right. A major concern is the dozens of people who are still trapped underground. Details are still extremely sketchy at this hour, but we're beginning to hear the stories of those who survived this attack. Let's listen. Ron Allen is covering the story. He is in our London bureau. Ron, we heard about several explosions in the underground or on the subway in London, as well as one that ripped the top off a double-decker bus. What is the current number of explosions you're hearing at this juncture?
The British Home Secretary
Allen in London. Let's go back to Sean Barron, who is 20 years old. He's from New Jersey. He is visiting London and witnessed what transpired there this morning. Sean, good morning again.
Hi, Katie.
You were mentioning that you helped triage several victims in the Marks and Spencer food court, as well as some hotels that have been opening up to help some of the injured. You were telling me about the extent of the most seriously injured. Can you elaborate on that for a moment?
On the serious injuries?
Yes.
Most of the people who were injured seriously were most likely treated in the tube station and transported directly to the hospital. The more serious injuries that we had, the people who were legs and arms, they had bad smoke inhalation, so they're having difficulty. Golden.
This is an NBC News special report.
It is 8:07 Eastern Time. Prime Minister Tony Blair is speaking once again. Let's listen.
Those responsible have no respect for human life. We are united in our resolve to confront and defeat this terrorism that is not an attack on one nation, but on all nations and on civilized people everywhere. We will not allow violence to change our societies or our values, nor will we allow it to stop the work of this summit. We will continue our deliberations in the interests of a better world. Here at this summit, the world's leaders are striving to combat world poverty and save and improve human life. The perpetrators of today's attacks are intent on destroying human life. The terrorists will not succeed. Today's bombings will not weaken in any way our resolve to uphold the most deeply held principles of our societies and to defeat those who would impose their fanaticism and extremism on all of us. We shall prevail, and they shall not.
You've been listening to British Prime Minister Tony Blair speaking for the second time this morning from Gleneagles, Scotland, the site of the G8 summit, flanked by Jacques Chirac and President George Bush. We'll have much more on this breaking story coming out of London in a moment, right after this. It is 8:10 Eastern Time. Welcome back. We just heard Prime Minister Tony Blair speaking from Gleneagles, Scotland, about the terrorist events that have occurred in London this morning just before 9 a.m. at the height of rush hour, affecting several subway stations as well as a double-decker bus. The number of casualties unclear at this point in time, and whether people remain trapped is also unclear. Meanwhile, President Bush, as we saw, was next to Prime Minister Tony Blair in Gleneagles, Scotland, where they have gathered for the G8 summit. Kelly O'Donnell is traveling with the president. Kelly, much for that update. And now here's Lester.
We want to go to Washington right now and find out more about what intelligence officials are doing. NBC's Andrea Mitchell is standing by. We just heard from Kelly, Andrea, that these meetings are going on. What does the early analysis tell U.S. officials about who might have been behind this and what the potential threat may be to this country?
Well, right now, at this hour, Lester, top intelligence officials are meeting at the relatively new National Counterterrorism Center. That is in suburban Virginia. It is not on the CIA campus. It reports to John Negroponte, the new director of national intelligence. They are all gathering. That meeting started, about 13 minutes ago, and they're analyzing all of the data. What they're doing now is going back because they're telling me they...
For that, we're going to swing over to Natalie Morales at the news desk. Natalie?
Good morning again, Lester and Katie, and good morning to you. Hurricane Dennis is moving toward the island of Jamaica. The storm...
Let's head outside for another check of the weather. Janice Huff is filling in for Al this morning.
Good morning, Katie. You may have just heard from Natalie about Hurricane Dennis, now a Category 2 storm and headed for Jamaica, expected to continue to strengthen.
With much more from London and Washington, and get world reaction to the events of this morning there after these messages. And talking this morning to eyewitness Sean Barron. He's a 20-year-old from New Jersey who is in London. He's working as an intern there over the summer. He is also a volunteer EMT and rushed to the scene to help some of those who had been injured in the blast. Sean, good morning again. Where you were when you saw this unfold. I understand you were riding a bus.
Al-Qaeda type operations and remove any possibility that it's an IRA operation, which I think
the IRA isn't
absolutely out of the question, personally.
Right. Stuart, while you're speaking, we're looking at a British helicopter. The Prime Minister is about to get on it, leave.
Continuing deliberations and discussions and being updated while the bombing was still taking place, as far as we know. An explosion had been reported, and they continue to meet.
It's a tradition of which I, as a former Englishman, am very, very proud. That parliamentary tradition of always being there, always in session, and vigorous debate as the events unfold.
Well, we're going to find out how long it's going to take now to leave.
Address just a short while ago, all the leaders here have an experience with terrorism, and the war against terror is an ongoing thing with all of them. We've received a bit of a briefing from President Bush's press secretary, Scott McClellan, to give us some idea of what happened here in Scotland after the events in London. About 20 minutes after the initial reports of the bombings in London, President Bush met with his
Chief of Staff Andy Card, also Deputy Chief of Staff Joe Hagan. The president went to his suite. The summit meeting was temporarily suspended. Mr. Bush went to his suite and convened a secure video conference of both Homeland Security and national security officials. The White House won't tell us exactly who all of them were, but the president's goal was to make sure, they'd say, that all appropriate agencies were responding and that all precautions were being taken. It was about that time that we learned that security in Washington's metro subway system had been stepped up with bomb-sniffing dogs and heavily armed police officers patrolling. Now, the president has no plans to return to D.C. Officials say whether or not the alert status in Washington will be increased is a matter for Homeland Security to decide. The U.S. has offered any assistance it can to the British. No indication that they've taken us up on that. But for now, plans are to continue with this.
Being identified. This investigation, Soledad, will take a while, but I believe that with help from ourselves as well as other countries, we will come to I think a quick understanding as to some of the people who were complicit.
As we watch pictures of the chopper that is carrying the British Prime Minister back to London from the G8 summit.
Our North African boys, meaning some of the North African type of militant Muslim groups.
It was, and of course, the following year in Evian, France, they dealt with, they came up with a plan for airline security and a way to deal with weapons of mass destruction. President Bush, of course, made it a central focus of last year's summit in Sea Island, Georgia. But here in Glen Eagles, Scotland, the leaders had been intending to focus on global security and African poverty. Now, I think you can imagine that there will certainly be a statement of support for the British, a statement of condemnation of terrorism, and the war against terror will find its way back to the top of the agenda at the talks here. Judge?
Wendell Goler, thanks very much.
All right, we're continuing to follow events over in London, as you may know, as you get up.
Suggesting there have been only four explosions is not confirmed. It is not sourced. According to Scotland Yard, there have been 7 explosions. In one of the stations, the Times Online reports that there was not only one of the subway trains, but there was also a bus. So that would explain why we've got 6 locations but 7 incidents.
The helicopter that you have just been watching now on the right of your screen as it flies into the distance contains Prime Minister Tony Blair and his immediate staff and security as they fly back to London for the Prime Minister to survey the scene, presumably address Parliament, and then come back to the summit in Glen Eagles later tonight.
Al-Qaeda.
This is an NBC News special report.
And good morning. If you're just joining us, it has been a terrifying morning today in London. A number of explosions on the city's transit system at the height of the morning rush hour. Tony Blair speaking from the Hold. Obviously, we're looking at a live picture from Glen Eagles, Scotland, of President Bush, who is expected to make some remarks. Tony Blair, British Prime Minister Tony Blair, has appeared twice so far this morning. He is on his way back to London to meet with authorities and plans to return to Scotland later in the day to resume the work of the summit.
And President Bush was among the leaders who stood in solidarity, stood behind Tony Blair as he made his last statement just a short time ago, and talking about the fact that these men are there to do good and the barbaric timing of this attack.
And insisting that the summit would not be disrupted. Let's listen to the president.
Spent some time recently with the Prime Minister, Tony Blair. I had an opportunity to express our heartfelt condolences to the people of London, the people who lost lives. I appreciate Prime Minister Blair's steadfast determination, his strength. He's on his way now to London, here from the G8 to speak directly to the people of London, who carry a message of solidarity with him. This morning I've been in contact with our Homeland Security folks. I instructed them to be in touch with local and state officials about the facts of what took place here in London and to be extra vigilant as our folks start heading to work. know, the contrast between what we've seen on the TV screens here, what's taking place in London, what's taking place here is incredibly vivid to me. On the one hand, you got people here who are working to alleviate poverty, to help rid the world of the pandemic of AIDS. They're working on ways to have a clean environment. And on the other hand, you got people killing innocent people. And the contrast couldn't be clearer between the intentions and the hearts of those of us who care deeply about human rights and human liberty, and those who kill, those who've got such evil in their heart that they will take the lives of innocent folks. This is the war on terror goes on. I was most impressed by the resolve of all the leaders in the room. Their resolve is as strong as my resolve, and that is we will not yield to these people. We will not yield to the terrorists. We will find them, we will bring them to justice, and at the same time we will spread an ideology of hope and compassion that will overwhelm their ideology of hate. Thank you very much.
You still say that the war is...
You've been listening to President George Bush in Gleneagle, Scotland, who has been attending the G8 summit, which officially got underway today, noting the contrast between the work that's currently being done at the summit, dealing with Africa, the worldwide epidemic of AIDS, to Scotland later on in the day, so he can express that resolve to continue the work.
He made the point very early on that he's there with these G8 leaders, and virtually all of them have seen and dealt with terrorism in their country. So
and for those of you who are continuing to join us on today, we're going to turn to Ron Allen, who's heard, and you didn't present him to the world at least.
How you doing? They're concerned about family and friends who were in London this morning. The State Department, we should tell you, has put together a hotline you can call for more information. That number is 888-407-4747. Again, 888-407-4747. Now, the tough job of figuring out who was behind this attack and where this might all lead. We want to bring in Bill Harlow right now. He's a former CIA officer. Bill, good morning to you. Thanks for this video, actually, that was taken on a cell phone inside a train. We can watch together. And as we look at this aftermath of the attack, we should note it doesn't take a lot of, I guess, coordination and intelligence to smuggle an explosive on a subway train. But the fact these were simultaneous attacks, does that narrow the list of those capable of pulling off something like this?
The simultaneous attacks has been a hallmark of Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda trained and associated organizations, so it does point in that direction, although because of the notoriety they have gotten for the prominence of their attacks, you can't rule out the possibility that it's another group that's just copying their techniques. But it does require a good deal of sophistication if the timing indeed was near simultaneous.
We're going to continue our coverage, however, of the events in London in just a moment. But first, your local news.
Good morning. London terror attack. The city is hit with multiple explosions this morning on the city's transit system. Police say there are multiple fatalities and as many as 300 injured today, July the 7th, 2005.
From NBC News, this is Today with Katie Couric and Matt Lauer. Live from Studio 1A in Rockefeller Plaza.
And welcome back to this special edition of Today on this Thursday morning. I'm Katie Couric.
And I'm Lester Holt in for Matt this morning. Prime Minister Tony Blair is now on his way back to London from the G8 summit. He first, though, labeled this in a public statement a barbaric act.
That's right. Understandably rattled and highly emotional in that statement, Lester. Meanwhile, President Bush, also in Gleneagle, Scotland, has expressed his sympathies for the people in London. He's encouraging those in the United States to remain vigilant against terrorism today. Many Americans are, of course, concerned about family and friends who may be in London this morning, concerned about their safety and their whereabouts. The State Department has put together a hotline that people can call for more information. Meanwhile, here's what one eyewitness had to say about the attack.
The windows came in and none of us knew what happened, and it was mayhem, and then the driver came out of the carriage and which was quite scary because he shone a red light, and we all thought it was, I thought I was dead. I had a vision of a fire, and then he came out and said, he walked us through the platform. It was just, other than, I don't know what happened.
The terrorists will not succeed.
We now have new video emerging from inside some of the subway cars shortly after the blast. Tourists and others who had cell phone cameras and video cameras capturing some of the moments right after the incident happened. Again, the descriptions from down there have been horrific. Smoke filling the cars, people trying to kick through the glass to get out, people getting down on the floor of the trains to find fresh air. Many people were evacuated.